Well, welcome everybody. This is a presentation about St. Thomas Aquinas in Thomism, the school of theology that uses Thomas's ideas and adapts them to whatever age that we're in. And so I'm part of the Thomistic Artists Guild, and so we promote theology and the arts. But since we're the Thomistic Artists Guild, there's probably going to be some questions, well, what exactly is Thomism? And sometimes you'll hear it called Thomism, and so it's a key of pronunciation, telling people about what Thomism is. But there's a lot that I want to talk about tonight. So part of it is, what is theology? What is a theologian? Who's Thomas Aquinas? What is a Thomist? A brief overview of the history of Thomism, and the current state of Thomism as of today. So to start with theology, well, it's the science of God. It's the study of God. And so out of all the sciences, this is the most important because its object is God. And if you're coming about it from natural reason, that's what we would call natural theology. If you're trying to get to the truth about God under light of divine revelation, well, that's supernatural theology. And the way Thomas looked at theology, he saw it as a whole. But it was later on that you started seeing more kind of divisions within theology. Dogmatic deals more with God, sacraments, biblical studies, and there's practical theology. Canon law and moral theology used to be together one time. Then you have spiritual theology. But it's important that we don't separate all these, that they're all part of a whole. Theology, the study of God. So whether you're thinking of it in terms of faith-seeking understanding or faith adoring the mystery, it is the science of God, that we do need to seek understanding, but we also do need to respect the mystery. So theology is the highest science. Philosophy is the handmaiden to theology as it pursues the truth. And then when we look at things like biology, chemistry, geology, all that, those are the daughters of philosophy. They're all pursuing what is true. And to distinguish theology from catechesis, catechesis is more instruction, word of mouth, okay? So when you look at your catechism, whether it's the Roman catechism or the 1992 one under St. John Paul II, that the catechism is there to literally hand down the faith to you. It's very instructional based. Some tend to be Q&A, some more wordy. Theology tends to be more broad and exploratory. So I added this quote from the document, The Gift of Truth, Donum Veritatis. And so this is something that Cardinal Ratzinger had written. And so here he says that the role of the theologian is to pursue, in a particular way, an ever deeper understanding of the Word of God found in the inspired scriptures handed on by the living tradition of the church. And so theology, we're not going to cease to understand the mystery. It's not like we're 99% done understanding God. No, even in heaven, when we receive the light of glory, we're going to keep learning more and more about God. Now, since theology is the study of God, there are different schools. So just like higher education has different colleges, universities, there are different schools within theology, but these usually revolve around a particular person and set of principles. And so in trying to put this together, I actually gave this talk at a Theology on Tap a couple years ago. I think everyone survived, but I know their brains were fried, but I'm trying to do better. But anyway, I reached out to a Thomist, Dr. Matthew Meinard. He's an Eastern Rite Catholic, teaches in Pennsylvania, but he definitely has a great love for Gary Goulet-Grange and has translated a lot of his work. And I asked him, well, what's a good definition for school of theology? And basically, it's the church is allowing certain speculation around some principles, and they're associated with the guilds. So another reason I like being called the Thomistic Artists Guild is the guilds are, yes, I do like the medieval time period of history, but the medieval time period of history was also very Catholic, and you had a very Catholic society. And so, of course, you would have these different schools coming out of these associations, these guilds. Franciscans had Don Scotus and Bonaventure, the Dominicans, of course, around Thomas Aquinas. But of course, his teacher, Albert the Great, was an excellent teacher as well. And so these schools of theology are within the parameters of the church, but think of them as different systems. So just like you have, Mac, you have PC, they're all computers, but there's different ways that they are a computer. So these theologies are different systems. But when we take a look at the vast parameters, we're looking at how our free will and God being all-powerful and all-knowing, how all that works together. Looking at the De Auxiliaries controversy, Domingo Banez with the Thomistic view, there's a heavier role for God kind of being involved, pushing you to the decisions you need to make. This is a very simplified explanation, where the Molinists put more weight on your free will and this kind of middle knowledge for God. The Augustinians would say God puts more of a moral pressure, and then the Synchronists put more of a pressure, idea of, well, where's prayer in the midst of this? So these are, and then congruism is basically trying to do a lot of a sense of synthesis as well. But all these different viewpoints, and I took this from the late Ludwig Ott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, all these are allowed by the church, and they're very different conclusions revolving around grace and freedom. But that's kind of what the schools of theology is. To kind of take a step back, there are things we must believe as Catholics. Okay, we do believe in a triune God, that God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost are all co-equal. Okay, someone was to go against that, well, that's an erroneous belief. Okay, so we need to make sure we don't have people in error. But when it comes to matters that are not determined yet, such as our free will and God being all-knowing and all-powerful, how that all works together, there's different schools of thought. Now, when we talk about a theologian, I think this is very important, especially today when it's easier to go get a theology degree, or even to get some type of certification online or through a diocese. I know people mean well, but historically, I do like the definition from the East, and this is something Dr. Minard wrote me in that email a number of years ago. A theologian is a man who prays. So I always think of theologian has to look like Gandalf, is very wise, as a long part of it's the Eastern vibe, but it's a man who prays. It's not just book knowledge. But then taking a look, from a Western perspective, Father Ripperger has a book called The Consensus of the Fathers and the Theologians, and it's a very good book because when we do theology, you don't just, it's not supposed to be like a quilt where each quadrant looks radically different. There needs to be a consensus there. That's how theology developed and is fine-tuned. And so a theologian, he's referring to a specific group of men from the various scholastic schools from the 12th century to the middle of the 18th century. Why ends in 1750? I'm not sure he's taking this from older manuals. Maybe we'll get some more specification later on. But when we take a look at theology, we don't just kind of take something in isolation. We need to take a kind of a whole approach, how something developed, from the scriptures, through the patristics, through the scholastics, so on and so forth. Now, when we talk about a theologian today, and I say this because just because someone says they're a theologian, well, are they? What does that mean? My former housemate, my last assignment, in many of our theological discussions, he'd been a priest for many, many years, he said, wait for the church to call you a theologian. So don't just wake up one day, oh, I'm a theologian, or just put on the internet, well, I'm a theologian. Okay, maybe you're very smart, you love the church, great, but wait for the church to call you a theologian. Okay, so here in that same document, Donum Veritatis, that we hear that basically the theologian is someone who receives a canonical mission or mandate to teach. So again, that's something that is given to you by the church. It's not something that you give yourself. And so, yes, we need to pray. And theologians, it's more than just, I have all these degrees after my name. You need to put those degrees to good use. So if you see Father O'Reilly, BLT, or you probably see FSSP, but no, you don't want to get confused with all the alphabet soup. It's important, but what's more important is to pray. That it's not just head knowledge, that we're actually praying and living this out. Now, out of all the theologians, St. Thomas Aquinas is the common doctor. So let's take a look at him. All right, so he's born in 1225 AD near Aquino, and he grew up in a noble family. And his parents wanted him to become the abbot. The Dominicans were still fairly new. This is a time period where a lot of mendicant orders are popping up. And so they didn't want him to go become a Dominican. But regardless, he was taught by John of St. Julian, Peter of Ireland. And so his family was not supportive of him becoming a Dominican. So his brothers captured him, and he was held for 2 years. And yes, he even hired a seductive woman to tempt him. And so what did Thomas do? He took a burning log and chased her out. And then the story is that the angels appeared, and then he was able to get a golden cord and had perfect chastity the rest of his life. And then it was after this incident his family believed him, and then he was allowed to join the Dominicans. So some family drama there. All right. So Thomas began to teach in Paris as a member of the Dominicans, and his great teacher was actually my confirmation saint, St. Albert the Great. And so Albert was patron saint of scientists, and so science came out of this scholastic environment. So natural science was coming out of a very philosophical and theological environment, and it's all rooted in pursuing what is true. Thomas would later be appointed Regent Master of Theology at University of Paris. Now, what Thomas was dealing with, I think it's a very gross simplification to say, well, Thomas just kind of took Aristotle and then, okay, the end. No, he didn't take everything Aristotle. Aristotle thought that the world was eternal. Obviously, we don't believe that. God created the universe ex nihilo, out of nothing. Okay? Obviously, that's not an Aristotelian belief. But obviously, Aristotelian concepts like the unmoved mover, hint, hint, wink, wink, that's God. Okay? So Thomas was able to take a lot from Aristotle in a time period where there was a renewed interest in what these ancient Greeks were talking about. But he was also had to find a balanced view between Averroism and Augustinianism. And so Thomas had to really work his way around this. And so Bishop Tempier, and he was the Bishop of Paris at the time, basically was condemning these Aristotelian Averroistic positions. So Thomas, his work was actually condemned. There was definitely a great prejudice against Aristotelian belief. There's a sense of we don't want any of that coming in. But Thomas is like, no, a lot of this is in teaching what is true. And so we know philosophy to be the handmaiden of theology. We don't want to disregard Aristotelian philosophy. It's going to better explain our faith. Now, Thomas was also teaching in a period of scholasticism where there was a lot of technical language and method. And so this is building upon what St. Augustine had done. And so Thomas is really that great synthesizer, okay? So he wrote a book, Catena Aurea, the Golden Chain. And so he's synthesizing what the early church fathers said. And I'm thinking this is with, the gospel commentaries. And so when I'm getting ready for preaching, I can take a look, okay, what did this saint, Thomas is a way of connecting all these saints in a chain. And so, again, consensus. So Thomas is very good with that. But he wasn't the only scholastic. There was a pre-scholastic period, an early scholastic period. He was in what we would call the high scholastic period. So all up there with St. Albert the Great, his teacher. And then, of course, St. Bonaventure for the Franciscan school, even though they would have been friends, even though they have a different way of looking at theology. And then the late scholastic period is when you start seeing the decline there with Occam's razor and kind of a sense of oversimplifying. But there are different periods. of scholasticism. Now, speed up toward the end of Thomas's life, he did have a mystical vision where basically afterwards he had stopped writing. So everything appears like straw. And so he had stopped writing on St. Nicholas' feast day, December 6th, 1273. And so he died March 7th, 1274, the age of 49 years old. And then it would be a couple decades later that Pope John the 22nd canonized him. Now, there's multiple works attributed to Thomas Aquinas. The Summa Theologica is what I use the most in preaching and teaching in my life as a priest. The Catena Aurea, I use that as well with preaching. The Summa Contra Gentilius is another famous work. For the scholastics, it was very common to comment on Peter Lombard's sentences, so these propositions. And so that was just a very common practice. But any Thomists worth their salt will take a look at all this as a whole. So just like you take a look at theology as a whole, you need to take a look at Thomas as a whole. Now, granted, that's a lot of work. That's a lifelong pursuit. All right. Now, some of the themes you see with Thomas, that of causality. Remember, God is the first cause, and then, for example, we're here secondary causes. Our parents, cooperated with God, that procreation bring us here. But he would have been very much aware of, the four causes that we see from Aristotle. He talks about God's essence and existence being the same for God, nature and grace. And so grace perfects our nature. Nature is our essence and action, and so grace perfects that. He talks about act and potency. Things that exist have a matter and form composite. He talks about the 5 ways proving God's existence. And the way he talks about God is through analogy. So saying something is like. So if you think, God is my rock, my fortress. Okay. God is literally not a rock. God is literally not a fortress. All right. But he's like a fortress and a rock because he's sturdy and he protects you. So analogy is how we talk about God. And so that's a very much an important characteristic of Thomas and subsequent Thomist. The other thing we see, when you read Thomas, it's not going to be like, it's definitely not a kid's book. Let's just say that the way it's written. He has these syllogisms to argue. And so you have an objection, counter-argument, Thomas's argument, and he replies. And so when we take a look at this question from the Summa, whether sacred doctrine is a science, he goes through objections. And what's great about Thomas, he doesn't straw man. Okay, and so this is very important today where arguing can be very emotive-based. Very, the ad hominem fallacy. Okay, well, someone could tell you the sky is blue. Well, you know what? You didn't pay your taxes. All right? But the sky is still blue whether I pay my taxes or not. And so you don't want to ad hominem. Okay, so we need to be objective. But what he does, he takes the best arguments from his opponents. Okay, so he's not taking the worst arguments and taking the best of his arguments. Iron sharpens iron. So he takes the best from his opponents and sometimes knows his opponent's arguments better than them. So what you'll see is there's a question posed, there's an objection, and then he, as on the contrary, basically, consider this point, and then I answer that. So then he gives his answer. And then he replies to the objections. And so the way that other priests might be different, but the way I do the Summa is I read the question, and then I skip to the I answer part. Then I go back to the objection, then to the reply, objection, reply. And then sometimes the objection, reply are, I would argue, could be their own question in and of themselves. But this was a great study tool for, continues to be for priests and theologians today. It is a monumental work. All right. So Thomas Aquinas, he dies at the age of 49. There's no direct disciple St. Thomas. All right, panic. What do we do? Well, go down memory lane, take a look what happened in the history here. So a lot of this material about history Thomism taken from Father Romanus Cessario, a very well-respected Dominican priest and professor, and he's quoting Weipfel here on Thomism is basically a theological philosophical movement beginning in the 13th century. It has a systematic attempt to understand and develop basic principles, conclusions of Thomas Aquinas, in order to relate them to the problems and needs of each generation. So it's not a way of reenacting Thomas, it's a way of taking Thomas and applying it today. Now, some very important questions are, well, which principles, which conclusions does a scholar accept in order to qualify as bona fide Thomist? All right? And then how much can a scholar continue to develop the idea of Thomas before it seeks to be Thomas and be something else? And so, again, there's other schools of theology, and just because you quote Thomas doesn't make you a Thomist. Okay, you're quoting Thomas, he's the common doctor of the church. We should quote Thomas because we're Catholic. I'm also biased, you should be a Thomist, but, Thomas is the common doctor, but just quoting doesn't make you a Thomist. So what Father Cessario talks about in his book, there's a sense of seeing Thomism in a very broad and a wide sense. So here, anyone following the spirit of Thomas manifest a dependence on this text, great. The fact that you can see that it's different from like a Scotus perspective, a Protestant perspective, great. But this is a very wide sense, and so not every Thomist is going to think this way. He also talks about an eclectic Thomism where these philosophical principles of Thomas are, you kind of bring in some other schools of thought. And so we'll see in the 20th century a lot of, like existential Thomism with Gilson and Jacques Maritain, look at Thomas on what he's talking about with existence, with being. But that's still very much within Thomism. We'll also see the way Thomism played out. You had a very kind of apologetic sense with Thomism after the dawn of Protestantism. And so Thomas was used for in an apologetic sense, and so kind of different from the historic Thomas. And so this eclectic Thomism is a way of taking the principles of Thomas and kind of mixing some other principles in. But of course, there can be a danger if you're putting in too much. Does it cease to be Thomism? And so, if you're cooking and you have your base and then you keep adding all these other ingredients, like eventually it's going to become everything soup, which usually that's what I make anyway. But, if you're a purist, there needs to be, you need to know what exactly this is. Now, a strict Thomism basically doesn't want to bring in any type of influence. There's a sense of a very pristine adherence to the principles of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. And so this is important. And we'll see a strict Thomism with after Pope Leo XIII's Aeterni Patris, so thinkers like Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, and trying to be very observant with Thomas. Now, ask a very simple question: is every Catholic a Thomist? Well, no. So just because you're quoting Thomas doesn't mean that you're a Thomist. It means you're being a Catholic. And what I like here, what Father Cessario talks about, if we start saying that everything is Thomism, basically that would mean everything since the high scholastic period is Thomism. And like, we haven't had any other schools of thought, and that's just not true. But we do quote Thomas because he is the common doctor, and he got a lot of things right. All right. But the other thing too whether we're a strict Thomist, a wide Thomist, an eclectic Thomist, we all need to follow the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay, if you're not following the mind of it, I don't know why you would call yourself a Thomist. Maybe just to try to give yourself some, credentials. But yeah, we do need to be following the mind of the great doctor. And so Cessario quotes Weitschel that there's some things that every Thomist should believe in: this matter and form composite, be metaphysical realist, in the reality of creation, God is, pure actual being, the use of analogy, and he gives some more. Now, the way that Thomism played out, there's four main stages. So, Thomas dies age of 49, and so from the 13th, 15th century, you have very much a defending of Thomas. And then to the 15th, 16th centuries, you start having these commentaries on Aquinas. They move away from just commenting on Peter Abelard. And then Council of Trent in the mid-18th century, there's an apologetics with Aquinas. So the way that questions against the faith are asked, is like, well, let's use Aquinas and to answer it. So there's kind of like an apologetics way of using Aquinas. And then after Aeterni Patris, there's this sense of neo-Thomism, a revival, where Thomism is used. Of course, the Enlightenment had been around, and so we need to have Thomas in the books and the manuals to make sure people are getting a solid education. So to go back to 13th century, not all of the people in Paris, especially the bishop, were excited about Aristotelian theses, and so there was a big prohibition. This was something that Thomas was caught up in, and so it was after his death that eventually these propositions, they were axed. Basically, the same day Thomas was canonized, these propositions were like, nope, they're gone. But what's really neat is that after Thomas died, the first person to go defend him was his teacher, St. Albert the Great. Like, that is so cool. He's a good teacher. And then Giles of Rome was also there to defend Thomas. Thomas of Sutton did critique of John's Duns Scotus. So believe it or not, there was an age before Reddit where people argued. It was called the Quod Libita. Okay, so you would have these discussions, and there would be debates, hopefully more respectfully and academically. And so you had these different schools of theology debating different positions. So the Franciscans had Scotus. Of course, Thomas of Sutton was on the Dominican side, but he was very much defending Thomas Aquinas. William of Macclesfield was another one who did a lot of work defending Aquinas. Again, you had these inter-school battles, Scotus, the Dominicans supporting St. Thomas Aquinas. In the 14th century, this is where Pope John the 22nd finally canonized Thomas, and those condemnations were finally cut. But toward the end of the 14th century, there was a waning, and so you had a great Western Schism, you had more of the Franciscan schools, William of Ockham's razor, and so there was a sense of Thomism waning. And also, too, when there were these debates, we know the Immaculate Conception is a dogma of the faith. We must believe it. It's one of the four Marian dogmas. The church ended up going more with the Franciscan Scotus view, Immaculate Conception. And so before that was finalized, of course, there were some inter-school debates. Now, just because the church in 100% side with Thomas, that doesn't mean you just throw Thomas away. Again, Thomas is the common doctor of the church, okay? Now, up until this point, if you were a theologian, you commented on Peter Lombard's sentences, these propositions. But beginning in the 15th century, this changed. There was a hinge where John Capriolas began, I'm not going to comment on Peter Abelard anymore. I'm going to comment on Thomas Aquinas directly. So this is where the commentary tradition on Thomas is out there. So I'm not against the commentaries. I do think it's important to look at Thomas himself, but knowing these commentaries, knowing what time period they're in, again, a lot of them are kind of in an apologetic, of course, the dawn of Protestantism and a lot of questions and attacks against the church. So you got to know why these commentaries were written. When we get to the 16th century, there's a critique of Thomas with Erasmus. Erasmus, I like to call him the most Protestant Catholic. He's very critical, but he never became Protestant. I'm just saying. He was about as not Catholic while still being Catholic. All right. And then when you have a divided Europe between Catholic and now Protestant countries, the Protestant ones aren't going to really want to teach Thomas Aquinas. Okay, they're going to go for a lot of those pillars of Protestant thought. And so that was one reason why Thomism waned. But then you have Cajetan promoting the commentary tradition again, critiquing a lot of the Protestant questions about the faith. When we get to the Council of Trent, a monumental council over a period of 18 years, the Thomists there at the council were there to help the church formulate that precise language of justification. And it was here that Pope Pius V, we know him, of course, favorite document, Quo Primum, but he also talked about Thomas Aquinas, that he is the doctor. He is a doctor of the church, and very much his Summa was highly venerated at this council. So he wasn't just a theologian. His works were venerated. Were very honored at Trent. When we get to the 17th century, we, of course, going back to the De Auxiliis controversy, Domingo Banez, Luis Molina, how does our free will and God being all-knowing, how does this all work out? Of course, Banez had the Thomist position, but the church never ruled on it. But despite that controversy, we did see some other forward motion with Thomism. John of St. Thomas wrote some commentary on gifts of the Holy Spirit, and well as for Thomas Aquinas. In the 18th century, we began to see a downfall of Thomism. You have Enlightenment, scientific and French revolutions. And then when we get into the 19th century, we do see, again, a return to advocate for Thomism. Enlightenment philosophy had been out there. And so you had folks that thought Thomism was key to ward off Kantian and Hegel's philosophy. And so we start having the manuals. Okay. So manuals, you might think, okay, I'm going to, put a washing machine together or this together. When you're a kid, Legos, they tell you, boom, 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 boom. Well, the manual is based off monos, hand. Okay. The whole point of a manual is to have something on hand. And so I like the manuals that you come out of seminary and like, wait, how do I be a priest? I was like, boom, got a book. It's great. Okay. Well, fortunately, manual tradition, there are better manuals than others and better teachers that teach manuals than others. But prior to Second Vatican Council, you had more of a manual tradition. And there's still manuals out there. I use Tanqueray, is very helpful. But manuals have their place, okay? It's important to go back to, it's doing a lot of synthesizing, but we do need to go back to like what it's synthesizing and so know where to go back to. But in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with the manual, but know what it's pointing to. You don't want to just read Cliff Notes. You want to go back to the actual source. But there's nothing wrong with Cliff Notes. All right. Klutkin believed that the older scholastic theology could better defend the faith in a post-Enlightenment period. Then, of course, we get to the famous document Aeterni Patris, where Pope Leo XIII is wanting to restore golden wisdom of Thomas Aquinas and make sure that people are receiving that in Catholic education. And, of course, it would help, too, when Pope St. Pius X was dealing with the modernist crisis. And so we want to make sure that people get the fullness of truth, the whole truth, and not a distorted and, you don't want to have any type of, deceitful language. We want to make sure we have a great precision in handing down the faith. And so, of course, being the Good Shepherd Pius X was, there was basically a purging from, Catholic institutions if you were a modernist. And modernist doesn't mean like you don't like recent, new technology. That's not what I mean. But modernism is basically over-rationalizing things, taking the squeezing the supernatural out of everything. And he called it the synthesis of all heresies. And so, of course, he definitely was familiar with Thomas and promoted Thomas. But the modernist crisis that Pius X was aware of, it doesn't just, go away. And Arianism never fully went away either. A lot of these things come back and are repackaged and all that. But what you saw in the 20th century, after this purge and the modernist crisis, there's kind of a new theology coming out of France. Okay, and so it wants to go do some more historical critical research, focus on the sources of faith, rather than kind of the traditional Thomistic route of, having propositions, doing deduction. This whole return to the sources, to go back to the Bible itself, to go back to the Fathers itself, in the historic Thomas. And of course, there's a very critical attitude in this neo-scholastic period, post Aeterni Patris. And so you had this looming about in the 20th century. And so in the first half of the 20th century, when it came to Thomism, you had individuals like Jacques Maritain trying to, here it talks about human intuition. He did a lot with the arts, so that's why I love his book, Art and Scholasticism. He was kind of more of a existential Thomist. Him and Gilson did a lot with that. You had Chenu, who wanted, well, let's just go back to the original Thomas. Okay. And so, again, going back to the sources, okay, there's nothing wrong, but it doesn't mean you get rid of the development that happens. Doesn't mean you just, let's go back here and cut out the Middle Ages. No. Now, 3 and 4 up here, transcendental. It's not my cup of tea. Okay, I'll be nice. Here, these folks really took in a lot of different ideology, and it's very hard to still call it Thomism. I would call them their own, school of thought. But this was out there, and it's, in the minds of different theological, culture. And then here, Neo-Thomism, or the Neo-Scholastic approach. Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, he did the 3 stages of the spiritual life. I love Garrigou. He's great, very crystal clear. And he helped John of the Cross become a doctor of the church. So he kind of had the ear of Pope Pius XI. And so he was at the Angelicum teaching for, I want to say, about 50 years or so. So he actually helped St. John Paul II with his first doctorate. And so Garrigou was very much, I consider him a hero. Other people consider him a dinosaur. And so there was definitely a lot of tension. And so when we have this nouvelle theologie in the atmosphere, all right, well, how are the Thomists responding? Well, Dr. Meinard, who I mentioned earlier, and a friend, John Kerwin, published a book talking about different articles, how the different Dominicans, the different Thomists, were responding to this new theology. And this is important, especially when we're trying to figure out what a Thomist is. Well, kind of what launched it were 2 articles, 2 of the Jesuit intellectuals, Donnelly, Guillard, and basically kind of these manifesto documents talking about we need to go back, positive theology, emphasizing history. And here we have a quote, a theology that would not be contemporary would be a false theology. So there's definitely a lot of like a new, something different in the air. There is not a great love for neo-scholasticism, and there's a sense of feeling restricted. So they want to really emphasize history, experience, culture. So a very new way of doing theology. And so what's the Thomistic response? Well, within the Dominican order, you had basically two camps. So you had the Toulouse response with Laborde and other theologians. And then Garrigou was in the Roman response. And so, I'm not going to go through every single article that they wrote, but Dr. Meinert and Curran did a lot of great synthesizing between this exchange, because this was all in the air before the Second Vatican Council about kind of the state of Thomism and kind of state of theology. And so Laborde and Nicolas, with the Toulouse response, is saying, yes, Thomism is in a difficult situation right now. We don't want it to become a relic. How is it going to be? Basically, they said it would be most appropriate for it to step aside and allow it to be replaced. So there was a sense of, we love this, but we realize there's kind of a newness in the air. Of course, Garrigou was not going to like that. And so the Roman response, those here, talks about where's the new theology headed. It says it returns to modernism. And of course, he dealt with modernist crisis under Pope Pius X. So he definitely wanted to, stick to his guns. And so looking at both schools, even here within the Dominican order, the Toulouse Dominicans trying to say, okay, theology, it's not just a bunch of propositions, that's it. No, we're trying to ascend to revealed truths. It's an exercise, it's more than just, I love Garrigou, and basically when he was teaching, you got to a point where theology had 24 propositions, okay? And 24 bullet points, and then they had commentaries on that. Garrigou did that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it's not everything, okay? No school theology isn't going to explain God 100%. But what I don't like is that, a lot of those propositions were just, theology was taught very differently after Garrigou. But having those propositions are helpful for sure. And the Toulouse Dominicans, they had an emphasis on theology is brought about through supernatural faith, and it's at the service of our intellectual resources. And what we learned from the Roman response, okay, again, Garrigou was involved with the initial modernist crisis under Pius X. He didn't want to have to go through that again. But when this kind of new theology is in the air, and it's like, okay, let's make use of history, not just have theology that's all deductive. Well, Garrigou does love history. And so, Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophy says are the works of centuries. Thomas is synthesizing all this history that happened prior to him. And when you look at how dogma develops, look at all that history. If we hated history, we wouldn't love the truth that we have, that there's so much history that goes into how these, dogmas were fine-polished and fine-tuned over time. So he definitely loves history. But he doesn't want to get rid of a kind of a deductive way of doing theology. Now, Garrigou died in 1965. Now, what Meinert and Curran do when they talk about how these two different responses in the Dominican order, their view was it doesn't have to be, okay, traditional Thomism, good, this kind of return to the sources, bad. It's no, you keep traditional Thomism, but being able to go back to the sources, where did this come from, and having kind of reflection and seeing things positive theology, they didn't think that was a bad idea. So kind of way of kind of taking the best from both. And when you go back to the sources again, remember there's a consensus of the theologians. You don't just go back to the early church and say, well, I don't like anything that happened after Nicaea. That's corruption theory. Okay, that's not good. And so we got to keep in mind the consensus from the patristics through the scholastics through today, okay? And so you can't just, cut the Middle Ages out just because you don't like it. And a lot of that comes from a kind of a Protestant Enlightenment perspective. All right, now, basically, when you had this in the background leading up to the Second Vatican Council, within the Dominican Order, the Toulouse and Roman response, basically, they're, instead of having more of a neo-Thomist, neo-scholastic language and kind of victory at the council, you had a lot of these Nouvelle theologians as the major influencers. So you see Kungar did a lot with Lumen Gentium, there's Ratzinger with De Verbum. But after this council, you started seeing two different camps. And a lot of it, like we talked about periodicals within Dominicans, you had the Roman response and the Toulouse response. After the Second Vatican Council, you had two different response periodicals. So you had the Concilium folks, Ronner, Kuhn, Skillebex, Kungar, and then Communio, where you have Balthazar, de Lubac, Wittia, and John Paul II. Now, I'm not an expert, neither camp, but just kind of just a general explanation. So here I'm taking this from Dr. Tracy Rowland, her Catholic Theology book. So a lot of this Concilium school does a lot with social theory and working with sociologists, topics such as human freedom and how do we restructure church teachings and practices, where some people took this way too far, and Kuhn, of course, was reprimanded. And he died a couple years ago. I'm not sure if he got reconciled with the church. You don't want to make a name. Remember, a theologian is a man who prays, so it's not just about alphabet soup. Now, with the Communio folks, here, Roland is quoting Pope Benedict XVI when talking about, well, what exactly is this Communio approach? Notice it's not a school, but an approach. He says, I have never tried to create a system of my own, an individual theology. What is specific, if you want to call it that, is that I simply want to think in communion with the faith of the church. That means above all to think in communion with great thinkers of faith. And so Cardinal Ratzinger, eventually Pope Benedict XVI, yes, did have a neo-scholastic education. Again, there's this kind of newness in the air, wanting something new. And so his approach is, how am I doing this with union? Remember, the church is a communion of saints, church militant, suffering, and triumphant. But he didn't think of himself in a different school of theology. Now that being said, what's the current state of Thomism? Remember, just because you quote St. Thomas Aquinas doesn't mean you're a Thomist. Hopefully you're quoting because you're Catholic. So Tracy Rowland here quotes 17 different schools of Thomism. So classical Thomism, of course, would be, coming, in the earliest sense, the early period of Thomistic history. You have Baroque, Leonine, Neo-Thomism. I'd argue transcendental Thomism, I really don't think is Thomism, just kind of the direction that Ronner and those folks went. Lublin Thomism would have been influential for St. John Paul II because that would, that's based out of Poland. Now, for current ones, the River Forest Thomism, that does a lot with science. And so they're Thomist around, and they take an Aristotelian approach, but they definitely want to make use of the natural sciences. I was looking at an article Dr. Fazer put together kind of on Thomism a number of years ago, and even when he's making reference to late Dr. Ralph McInerney, he would kind of pick and choose a little bit, and so yes, we love Gary Goo, but he, definitely would, take a look at, other Thomists of the 20th century. I know even here being in the Thomistic Artist Guild, I love Gary Goo and the stages of the spiritual life. I love propositions, but Maritain wrote a book about art, and so I'm going to use it. And so, with Tracy Rowland, she uses this example of, kind of a mixed drink. How do you want your Thomas? Straight on the rocks, shaken, stirred. But she has a point when there's so many different variations. That being said, when it comes to picking a school or going down an eclectic route of Thomism, stay in the church, but realize that, I'll just say this from including Mark's Father Cessario, we don't want to use the name and stretch it so much that it doesn't really mean anything anymore. And so he says that when it comes to Thomist, so there's not an official body in the church that's going to excommunicate someone from, the Thomist party. The River Thomists aren't going to excommunicate the Augustinian Thomist. It's just, no, it doesn't work like that. Now, if you want to see kind of, well, really, what is a Thomist? What's the best way? Well, turn to the Dominicans. I mean, he's their guy. But I do like this quote from Father Cessario, that we don't want it to become so expanded and milky that it doesn't mean anything anymore. So in short, remember, theology is the study of God, and there's different schools. Just because you have, you pick one school, okay, don't be a jerk to someone who has another school. But even if you're not a Thomist, Thomas is the common doctor of the church. And there's multiple doctors. We just had Cardinal Newman made a doctor of the church. That's great. Thomas is the common doctor. Just because someone makes a reference to Thomas doesn't make him a Thomist. And I would say with charitable discussion, make sure your discussions are charitable when talking about theology. There's nothing wrong with debates, as long as you're respectful, respect the magisterium of the church. And so, I hope this helps with kind of the current state of Thomism. Again, for the Thomistic Artist Guild, yes, I'm going to draw a lot from Thomas Aquinas himself. And of course, everyone, Thomas drew from Aristotle, Plato, St. Augustine. So I'm not going to not use those individuals. But I am going to be drawing from Maritain, Gilson, other Thomistic thinkers. And so even within Thomism, there's a lot of different thinkers. So that being said, thank you for being here, and let's have St. Thomas pray for us.